Hello, this is Professor Gallagher, and this video should be a great first app video. So if you've never built an iPhone app before, or even if you're entirely new to programming, this is a great place to start. Now we're going to build an app that behaves like the classic prediction ball toy that you've probably already played with. Now there are lots of versions of this. Here's one of the more popular ones. You ask it a question, you shake it up, and this round oracle provides you with an answer. Now the classic toy is a bit clunky, it's not easy to carry around, so in this video, we're going to assume that you've never coded before, we're going to make a bit of magic as we learn to create our own prediction ball so that you can keep it in your pocket and break it out app style whenever you need some app-served guidance. But in order to build an app, you need Apple's Xcode software development tool installed on your computer, and you need an Apple developer account. Now both of those things are free, but if you haven't installed them yet, you need to do that first before we can begin. Now there are step-by-step instructions on how to do this in the first video at the playlist at bit.ly/prof-g-swift, and those are all lowercase letters. Now the video that you want to watch is named Chapter 1, Getting Started, and once you've gone through that, you've set up Xcode, you've got your Apple developer account, come on back and we're ready to begin. Now when you write a report, you use a program like Microsoft Word. Well, when you build apps, you need a program too, and that's Xcode. So I'm going to start Xcode by clicking on the icon in my dock. You might have Xcode installed in your application folder if you haven't dragged a version into your dock yet. Either way, click that icon to start Xcode. And then we're going to select Create a New Xcode Project. Now Xcode will show you this window. All the defaults that should be set are what we want. So iOS is already highlighted in the top row. Single View App is also highlighted. Don't change any of these, just click Next. Now let's name our project. I'm going to call mine Prediction Ball. You can call yours whatever you'd like. For language, Swift should be selected. Now Xcode also allows you to develop using a programming language called Objective-C, but that's older technology that Apple is shifting away from, so we're going to be using Swift. And this next bit is very important. For user interface, select Storyboard, not Swift UI. There's a chance that you have Swift UI selected. That's a different technology, so you definitely want to pull down here and select Storyboard. Now we're going to work with a storyboard which will allow us to drag and drop objects that we'll see in our app, like labels, buttons, and the image view that holds our 8-ball image. Now with storyboard selected, click Next. Select a place to save your project. I'm going to save mine to the desktop and click Create. And we've got a project. Now you don't have to do this now, but if you did head over to the Finder and took a look at the location where you saved your project, you'd see a folder with the same name as your project. If you ever quit Xcode and want to get back into your project, just go back into your projects folder and select the project's Xcode proj file. Mine's called predictionball.xcodeproj. That'll launch your project, just like clicking on a Word doc will launch Word and open up that file. A quick warning, don't move your project file around if Xcode is open. So if you want to move your Xcode project folder to a different location on your Mac, you can do that. Just make sure that you've quit Xcode first. Also, don't move any of the files that are inside of your main project folder. Xcode expects things to be in a particular place, and if you start moving things around inside, you could break your app. So with that warning out of the way, let's get back into Xcode, and I'll double click in the title bar up here just to expand my window to full screen. Now, Xcode is pretty complex software, but one piece of advice when you're starting out is to ignore the complexity. So that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to zoom in on the place where we can begin to lay out our app on a rectangle that looks like an iPhone screen, and we do that by clicking right here on the left-hand side of our screen where it says main.storyboard. And when you click there, you'll see an image of what looks like an iPhone on your screen, and that's where we'll start. But a few quick side notes. Now this column on the left contains the names of files and folders that are part of this project. It's called the Project Navigator. And if you ever lose your place, which can happen, so for example, if you abruptly quit the simulator, or if your program crashes while it's running, Xcode might drop you into a different area where one of these other icons along the top are highlighted. Just move your cursor over to this little folder icon in the upper left, click that to select it, it'll turn blue. That'll bring you back to the Project Navigator. Another tip for newbies, these icons in the upper right-hand corner will show or hide panes on the left, right, or bottom of the central Xcode editing area. They're blue when the pane on the left, right, or bottom is showing. They're gray when it's hidden. So if you need more room, hide one of these panes. If you need to get back what was hidden, click on it to show it. So the Project Navigator over here on the left has our project files. The pane just to the right of it is the document outline. This shows a list of what's in the main storyboard. Now when you click on main storyboard, you see this area where you lay out your iPhone app. It's called the Interface Builder or the Interface Builder Canvas. And on the lower left of the Interface Builder is another one of these toggle icons. This one shows or hides the document outline. For some reason, the line doesn't turn blue when it's clicked and the document outline is showing, but it otherwise works just like the other ones. Now down at the bottom of the interface builder, you'll see an area that says View As. If images of iOS devices aren't showing, you can click on View As. It acts as a toggle, and you can click any of these device sizes as the device template when laying out your interface. I recommend choosing the second one on the right, the iPhone SE. This is the smallest device that runs iOS 13. The iPhone 4S is smaller, but the max iOS that runs is iOS 9, and that's not a very big market, so I wouldn't jump through hoops to try to develop for this smaller size, at least not at the time when I'm recording this video. Now we're going to start to drag elements over onto our user interface, and in order to select those, we're going to click on this plus sign in the upper right hand corner. That pulls up something called the library. Now for reference, we're going to add 4 objects to our app's interface. We've got a label up here. We'll use this to put in the text Magic 8 Ball, just a description of what the user's looking at. We'll keep the font used in this label as standard, but we'll center the alignment. We'll add an image view. This is a container that can hold images in the way that a label can hold text. We'll put an 8-ball image inside of it. We'll add a button here. Clicking this will generate the random prediction, just like shaking the 8-ball. And we'll add another label down below. We'll align things center, and we'll change the font to Avenir Next Condensed 36 points. If yours looks a little different, know that this icon on the right here will either show or hide descriptive information, and what you want to have clicked is this icon that looks like a donut with a square in the middle of it. That shows the interface element object library. This lists all of the interface objects that you can drag into your app. We want a label. Now we can see label right up top, but also know that the search box up here is the object filter, and it'll filter the list so that you only see those items that have a name containing what you typed in there. So now that I see label, I'm going to hold down my mouse, and then drag this object and let go right on top of this outline of an iPhone. If you drag near the sides and the corners of the iPhone outline, you'll see margin lines that encourage you to leave a bit of space in between the objects and the borders of the device. I'm going to let go of my mouse right here so that the upper left-hand corner of my label is positioned right where these upper left margin lines intersect. Now I can see my label is still selected, and I have these white boxes around the edges. Those are referred to as handles. I'm going to click the handle in the lower right-hand corner and just drag this label out so that it hits the other margin on the right-hand side. I'll let it go, and it's resized. Now make sure that you click on the label again and look in this pane at the right hand side. This is called the Attributes Inspector. So this blue arrow that you see downward pointing is selected. If not, make sure that you click on it. You'll know you've clicked the label because it says label in the top left of the Attributes Inspector. If you didn't click on the label, then make sure that you've clicked it and you see label up here. And this lists all of the attributes or the properties that are associated with a label. Now one of these is text, and you see the word label underneath it, and that's the text that's inside of the label. First, let's change the alignment. So you see these symbols that look like the alignment in a word processor. Let's click on the one for center alignment, and you see the text label that's inside of the label is center aligned. Now I'm going to change that word label to Magic 8 Ball, and I could do it either by clicking and replacing the word label up here in the attribute, but instead I've double-clicked the word label to highlight it, and I'll type the phrase Magic 8 Ball right over what I've highlighted. And notice when I press return, it also changes where it said label in the Attributes Inspector. And now I want to add an image view to show our 8-ball image, so I will click on the plus sign to bring up the library, search for the word image, then drag over this image view object and plop it where I see the upper left-hand corner of the image view is aligned with the margin lines on the iPhone just below the label. With the image view clicked, I can see the handles. I'm going to drag the handle in the lower right-hand corner and make this so that it's roughly square, but you can make it exactly square if you have the image view selected, then go up just to the right of the down pointing arrow for the Attributes Inspector. You'll see something that looks like a ruler. That's called the Size Inspector, and that will allow us to set up the size of any selected object. So click on the ruler to select the Size Inspector, set the width to 288 and the height to 288. That makes it exactly square. Then I'm going to add a button just below the image view. Hey, I bet you know how to do this. Just go up to plus, bring up the library, type in the word button. You see a bunch of different options in here. All of these contain the word button. We want this first one that's just called button. Drag this over, center it just below the image view, and let go. Now this button has the generic title button. That's not good enough for us. So let's click back on the Attributes Inspector. That's this downward pointing arrow. My button is selected. That's why I see the word button in the upper left-hand corner of the Attributes Inspector. These are all the attributes for the button. And we'll change the title down here from the word button, highlight it, backspace over, and type instead, answer my yes/no question. Press return. We see the title of the button is changed. Now we want to add one final label to show the results of our prediction. So we'll go up to the library, type the word label in, drag the label over, release it so that its top left corner is on the left margin just underneath the button. Drag the lower right hand corner to the opposite margin. Give yourself a decent amount of space as I've done here. Set the alignment to center. I'm going to replace the word label up here with some dummy text, but I want to see what it's going to look like, so I'll type in, "This is where your answer will be!" exclamation point. Press return. The text in the label changes. This font doesn't look very impressive for a prediction, so let's change the font properties. And you do that by clicking on this little T that's just to the right of the font attribute. Now click next to the font attribute here where it says System-System. That will pull up a lot of different options. Select the one that says Custom. You'll see the font box change. Now we can select a font family. So let's click in there, and I want to select Avenir Next Condensed. You can scroll to it, or you can start to type the name, and it will scroll to the letters that you've typed. So I'm going to select Avenir Next Condensed, and down here under size, I'm going to type in 36 and click Done. Now notice the text we put in our label is too big. The ... means it goes way past the right-hand edge of our label box, but there's an easy way to fix it, although it's not very intuitive. Under this lines property here, if you press the down arrow, instead of it being set to one line like it is initially, it'll set it to 0 lines. Now 0 lines doesn't mean there are 0 lines of space. Instead, 0 lines will expand the number of lines to be the number of lines that are needed for whatever size text you're trying to enter into your label. Cool. Not intuitive, but cool. Now we currently have no image inside of our image view. If we click on our image so that we can see the attributes in the attributes inspector for our image view, you can click on the downward pointing arrow next to the image attribute and you'll see a bunch of system images that Apple gives us. Now none of these is a good 8-ball image, but I've set up a Google Drive where you can download an 8-ball image to use, and if you don't like mine, feel free to use your own, but the steps to add an image will be exactly the same. Now we're going to drag our image into an area of your Xcode project called the Assets Catalog. And in the project navigator on the left-hand side, click this little blue folder that says assets.xc assets. This is the assets catalog. It's where you can store resources for your app, like your app's icons, sounds, custom colors, and other images. Right under where we see app icon, there's nothing else. In fact, there's nothing inside of app icon either. We're going to drag our 8-ball image into this area in the assets catalog, and then this will give us access to that image inside of our app. First, to get the image that I put online for you, you can go to the URL bit.ly/swift-8-ball, all lowercase. That'll pull up this Google Drive here. Right-click on the file. It says 8-ball-image.zip. Then select Download. If your browser asks you where you want to save this, save it where you saved your project. Mine is on the desktop, so I'll save it there. If your browser does not ask you where to save this file, then it's probably going to save it automatically inside your Downloads folder. So for you folks that weren't asked where to save it, look inside your Downloads folder for the 8-ball.images.zip file. Now again, I saved mine to my desktop, so I'll head over to my desktop, or if it didn't ask you where to save, look in your Downloads folder, find the zip file, double-click it, it will decompress this file, and that'll create a folder called 8-ball images. Double-click to open up that folder, then click on one of these PNG files, hold down the Option key, click on the second file so that they're both selected, then drag them over into your assets catalog inside of your Xcode project. Release. You see both of these images have been added to your project. Now we're ready to add one of these images to our image view. So I'm going to return to the main storyboard by clicking on main.storyboard in the project navigator on the left. Then make sure that you've clicked on your image view. You should see image view in the attributes inspector. I'm going to go under where it says image, click on this downward pointing arrow, and I see in addition to the system images I saw before, there are 2 new images up top that are called project images. One is 8-ball and one is 8-ball blue. Select the one that says 8-ball, and ho-ho, look, we've got an 8-ball in there. Looks marvelous. By the way, if the image didn't look like it was being sized properly, you can try some of the different options under content mode, but it should be aspect fit by default, and that should be perfect for our app. Now we've been creating our interface using the template of an iPhone SE. What if you wanted to run this on a bigger iPhone? Well, down here in View As, I'm going to click on a max-sized iPhone. I'll ignore the iPads for now. And oh, yuck! This does not resize properly. Everything is in the upper left-hand corner of the iPhone. That's because those are the dimensions of the iPhone SE that I originally designed this interface on. So how can I get these images to resize for larger iPhones? Well, Xcode will allow us to set up what are called constraints on interface objects. And this will set where an interface object will be on devices of different sizes. So you can constrain the edges of any interface object to the edges of the device itself, to other objects. You can also set an object's height or width to a fixed amount, and you can set the object to resize, preserving its dimensions. And you can also set an interface object to center horizontally or vertically in the device, among lots of other options. So let's see how this works. First, let's return to the iPhone SE size by clicking on iPhone SE in View As. Now things are back to looking good because this is the device that we designed on. Now let's first click to select the topmost label that says Magic 8 Ball. Now there are some other options over here on the size inspector, but we'll ignore these for now and we'll jump down into the lower right hand corner of the interface builder canvas. And you see a bunch of icons down here. Find the one that looks sort of like a Darth Vader TIE fighter. It looks like a little rectangle with two vertical lines attached to either side. If you hover your cursor over it, you'll see a little tooltip that pops up that says Add New Constraints. We'll click this and it will allow us to add constraints for the label that we selected, and this little box pops up. Now we're going to constrain the top border of our label, the left-hand side, and the right-hand side. The numbers that you see in here, 20, 16, and 16, are how far this label is from the rectangle that represents the part of the iPhone screen that the user can see in their app. Technically, this is called the safe area, and on an iPhone that has the sensor housing, the notch at the top, it won't include that space, and it also won't include the part of the screen on the bottom that's curved. These are good default options, so we're going to make sure that we've clicked on these little lines to make them red to indicate that we are going to constrain on the top, the left, and the right. You see how they get darker? If yours doesn't say 20, 16, and 16, you can type those numbers in. Now I also want to click on the height constraint. So mine says 21. I'm going to click right here to highlight that box. And now collectively, these four constraints that I'm about to attach to this label with the word Magic 8 Ball in it will reset this label so that it will be sized this way. If I'm on a new iPhone, if it's a bigger device or a smaller device, the top edge of my label will always be 20 points away from the top of the view that the user can see. That's 20 points from the top of a standard iPhone like an iPhone SE, or 20 points below the safe area on an iPhone with a notch or with curved screen corners. It'll be 16 points from the left-hand side and 16 points from the right-hand side, and it will always be 21 points tall. You should see Add 4 Constraints in the button. Click on Add 4 Constraints, and boom, we've set up constraints for our first label. Now let's click on the image view and set constraints for that. Now mine say 8, 16, and 16 for the top, left, and right. If yours don't, you can type those values in. Also make sure that you've clicked on these three lines so that they turn a darker red. And then I'm going to go down here and instead of setting the height, I'm going to click on aspect ratio. And what the aspect ratio does is it keeps the same width to height ratio. So if my width gets larger because I'm on a larger iPhone, the height gets proportionately larger. If the width gets smaller, the height gets proportionately smaller. So the box always has the same shape. It's never distorted so that it's stretched longer or it's squished flatter. So now with these four red lines clicked and aspect ratio clicked, your button should say Add 4 Constraints. Click that. Now let's click on the button below the image view. Click on Add New Constraints, and these settings are all good. Notice that it says an 8 for our top constraint. Well, what does that 8 represent? If I click on the drop-down arrow next to the 8, I can see what things could be constrained to. And I see my bottom option is selected. That represents an image view. It says 8 ball next to the check mark because that's what's inside of the image view, an image named 8 ball, and it says use the current distance, which is 8 points from the 8 ball image above it. No need to change that. This looks perfect, but I am going to make sure that I click the line underneath the 8 so that it becomes red and is selected. I can see that my button down below now says Add 1 Constraint. Now I don't want my button to resize. I don't want it to get larger or smaller, so I don't want to link it to the left or right side of my screen. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on Width and Height so that I can keep the current width and height. Then I'll click on Add 3 Constraints, and I'm almost done, but not quite. Xcode is showing a horizontal red line in here. How come? Well, Xcode knows where to place this button vertically, just 8 points below the image above it, and it knows that the height and the width of the button are fixed, but it doesn't know where to place the button horizontally because we didn't anchor it to either the right or the left-hand side like we did with the label in the image above it. The horizontal position, or from a geometry perspective, the y-axis position, hasn't been set. So now what we're going to do is to tell Xcode to center this label on the screen, so not to constrain it to either side. So what we'll do is we'll click on this little icon that looks like two left justified rectangles. This brings up this box that says Add New Alignment Constraints, and we're going to click on this item that says Center Horizontally in Container. Then we can just click Add One Constraint, and the red line goes away because Xcode now knows exactly where to position this button on an iPhone of any size. It'll center it horizontally. Now we've just got to set the constraints on this message label below it, so click that, then click on Add New Constraints. Mine says 16, 16, and 16, so those are perfect sizes. You can change those if you'd like, and I'm going to click on the top, the left, and the right-hand lines to make sure that those constraints are set. And I'm not going to bother setting the height because I'm going to let this label resize depending on whatever text is inside of the label. Some text will need more space, some text will need less. So click Add 3 Constraints, and now we've set up constraints on all 4 of these interface objects so they'll resize on different device sizes. So now let's go over here in the View As area and click on a max-sized iOS device. And sweet Johnny Ive, will you look at that? Your interface elements resize perfectly. Everything looks great. Now, a warning, there are a few bugs in Xcode, at least in the most current version that I'm using at the time that I record this video, where sometimes things look just a little bit quirky. We see that with the Magic 8-Ball label up top. See how it looks like the right side of this label is hanging off the edge? It might not look that way on your device, and if not, that's great because it means that Apple's fixed this bug in Xcode. There's not a problem in the way that we've set things up. There is a bug in Xcode where it's not rendering the way it's going to look on a device. To get Xcode to behave and show this the way that it's really going to look on the device is I will click on the label itself and drag it just a little bit off where it was set by the constraints. And what happens then is you see these orange lines show up. Those orange lines mean, hey, the thing that you're seeing positioned on screen must have been moved because this isn't where the constraints are telling Xcode to position that interface object. But you can just go down here and click on this leftmost icon in our row of icons in the lower right-hand corner. That leftmost icon looks like a circular arrow. That's the Update Frames icon. That will show up and highlight if you see any orange lines on your interface. Just click that. That forces Xcode to refer back to its constraints and to fix the layout of any items that are on Interface Builder. That should correct what we were seeing in the bug. It wouldn't affect how our app runs. It's just a bug in this version of Xcode, and I wanted to point it out in case you encountered it too. But our constraints work perfectly. If I click back on iPhone SE, the interface elements resize. I do see a little quirkiness again with the Magic 8-Ball label here, but we know how to fix it. Click it, drag it off a little bit, click on the Update Frame swirly arrow icon, boom, everything's looking good. Hey, let's see how this app will look when we run it on an iPhone. What I'm going to do is I'm going to set up the simulator so that when I run this on a simulated iPhone on my Mac, I'm going to have Xcode simulate a particular iOS device. So over here in the upper left-hand corner, just to the right of this thing that looks like an architect's icon A, it says Prediction Ball, which is the name of our project. Then there's a little arrow. Mine says John's iPhone. Yours might just say generic iOS device, but regardless of what it says, if you click on this in the exact location where my cursor is, you'll see a menu pop up. You'll get an option to select lots of different types of devices. Oh, I'm going to select the kind of iPhone that I currently own, which is an iPhone 11 Pro. That sets the simulator to simulate, to pretend to be an iPhone 11 Pro. Now I'm going to click on the play button. That's the triangle icon just to the right of the red, yellow, and green traffic light icons. That's going to build and run my app. It'll take a few seconds for this to run. You'll see the progress right here in the title bar of this window. So you can see mine currently says building, launching, and then it's hammer time. You see the hammer in the middle of your screen that says build succeeded. No bugs. Excellent. Now I'll speed up my video so you don't have to sit around and wait for my app to load. But all of a sudden, ho-ho, I see a representation of my app running in a simulator on my Mac. And even though I designed it on an iPhone SE, I'm simulating an iPhone 11 Pro, looking good. Take a congratulations lap, but the app doesn't do anything yet. Let's add some code to make this 8-ball do some guessing. Now the first thing I want to do is to clear out the text in our label. When our app first runs, I don't want to see this text that says, "This is where your answer will be." I want that label's text to be blank. Now I could just delete the text inside the label's text attribute, but that'll shrink down my label, and I like seeing the text when I'm designing the app. It gives me a better sense of how my app will look when it's running. So the first bit of code that we'll write will clear out the text attribute of this label when our app first runs. Now over here in our project Navigator, we've been working in main.storyboard, but the code that we're going to write to control the interface that we laid out on the main storyboard is going to be inside of this file called viewcontroller.swift. So let's click on this. Now we see lots of stuff in this file, but don't feel like you've got to understand everything that you see here during your first app. The stuff that you see in green with the 2 slashes in front, those are comment lines. They're not code, they're just documentation. Nothing on the line after the 2 slashes executes. Now this line saying class view controller says that this file is our blueprint for the code that's going to control our view controller. And the view controller is that outline of the iPhone that we were working with on the main storyboard. So I'm going to link some of the objects that were on my main.storyboard with this file so that I can change them in my code. And I'll give myself more room by clicking on this icon in the upper right-hand corner to hide the inspector's pane on the right. And then I'll put my main storyboard side by side with my view controller code. And this is called the assistant editor mode. And I can do this by holding down the option key and clicking on the second file that I want to show next to the one that I'm looking at. So that's going to be main storyboard. So I'm going to hold down the option key while clicking on main.storyboard, and you'll see the main storyboard appear in a window to the right of the viewcontroller.swift file. So I want to link this label that says, "This is where your answer will be," to my code so that I can write statements to change its text. So I want to plug this label into my code. Well, when you think about plugging an appliance into a power source, what do you need? You need an outlet. So to plug our label into our code, we're going to create something called an IB outlet, or an interface builder outlet. And Xcode will write that code for us. So this is how you create an IB outlet to plug an interface object into your code. While you hold down the control key, click on the interface object that you want to link to your code. And for us, that's this label. Now keep holding down the control key, and while you still hold down your mouse button, drag from the object into your code. Now you'll see that a drawing line comes from the object. Sometimes that's called the rubber band line. And we're going to drag that line so that it's just underneath this line in your code that begins with the word class. That's where most programmers put their IB outlets. So I'm going to let go just below this class line, and Xcode will let us set up the outlet. Now this box pops up, and we need to give our outlet, this label, a name so that we can refer to it in our code. And most programmers name their outlets using what's called lower camel case. That's a naming convention that uses a single word. It starts with lowercase letters, and if there are any additional words in the name, you use an uppercase letter for the first letter in that word. The capital letters make the name look like the humps on a camel. And you don't put any spaces in between the words. So we'll name our label message label, all one word, no spaces, all lowercase, except for the capital L that starts the word label. Now we also see that the type of object in here is a UI label. That stands for user interface label. Yep, that's what we dragged over. Nice work. Don't worry about it saying weak in here. It's supposed to. Leave it in there with a confidence that your coding skills are getting strong. And then click on connect. And hey look, Xcode wrote a line of code for us. Now this is an IB outlet. The word var stands for variable. That means that we can vary, or we can change the values that are inside of this outlet that we just created. Message label is the name that we just gave it, lower camel case, nice work. And the colon UI label says the variable called message label, it's a user interface label. Now don't worry about the exclamation point. It's supposed to be here. You'll learn about that later. Just know that Xcode wrote the code for us and that this will work. Now, when we first created our project, Xcode wrote another bit of code for us. It's this chunk of code here that's named viewDidLoad. And it's a function or a group of lines that are run together when called. Now, it starts with this curly brace after the line that names the function, and it ends with this curly brace. And anything inside these curly braces will run when this function runs. Now this function runs automatically when the view controller first loads. That's when our app first starts up. So if you want to do anything special when the app starts, put it in between these curly braces. And if we want to clear out the text inside the message label that we created when the app first starts, then this is a really good place for us to put that code. So first I'm going to get rid of the green comment line inside here. We don't need it, so I'm going to highlight this line and delete it. Now be careful not to delete any of the extra stuff in your code. If you remove one of these curly braces by accident, your code won't run. Computer programs will require things to be just so, and any missing or extra characters could cause problems. And if you make a mistake, hey, Xcode has an undo option just like other Mac programs. Just type Command-Z to undo the last thing that you did. Now let's look at what we want to change. So just to remind you, I'm going to click on the label and look at the attributes inspector over here on the right. And there's an attribute named text, and just below it, that's where that I can see this text that says, this is where your answer will be. Now here's how I can change it inside of my code. First, in between the curly braces for my view did load, I'm going to start to type the name of the thing that I want to change. That's message label. See, we named it up here? And Xcode is super helpful. As soon as I start to type the word message, Xcode will show me everything it knows about that has the letters MESSAGE in its name in that order, including the message label that I created in this file. You can see it right here. Now to the left of the message label, it says UI label, reminding me that this thing called message label is a type of label, a UI label or user interface label. And the V over here says that it's a variable, meaning we can change or vary its contents. If your cursor isn't already highlighting message label, you can move the arrow keys on your keyboard to highlight message label, then press return. Now, one way to think about this variable message label is it's a box named message label that contains data inside of it. And the data describes how our message label looks in our app. Now, we saw earlier that message label contains lots of attributes, information about the font size, the alignment. Well, we want to change the text attribute. Now, the way that we can get at the attributes that are inside of something that we've named is to use what's called dot notation. I'm just going to type a dot or a period right after its name, no space in between them, and we see a whole bunch of options show up. These are all the things that are part of the message label. Now, we're going to ignore most of these for now, but if we start to type in the word text right after the dot, no space, hey! All these attributes show up that have the word text in their name, including text color, text alignment, and this one here that's just called text. That's the one we want. If it's not highlighted in your version of Xcode, just move the cursor keys until it is highlighted, and it says right here to the left, it's a string. Now, string is a computer term that means it's a string of characters. It just means it's a block of text between double quotes. And that's the text that we see inside of the label. And the V here means that we can vary the contents of this text attribute. So I'm going to make sure that this text attribute is highlighted, and I'm going to press return, and it's added to my code. So it says message label dot text. Now the .text piece is like a little data holding box inside of a bigger data holding box named message label. And there are other boxes inside of message label too that hold the text color, the text alignment, all of those attributes that we saw in the attributes inspector, and that also popped up after we typed a dot after message label. Now the .text attribute is like the little box that holds our text that first appears when our app runs. This is the code that contains, this is where your answer will be. And we want to set this box inside the box, this text attribute inside of message label, to be equal to something else. Specifically, we want to empty it out, make it an empty string. That's just double quote with nothing inside of it. By the way, when you see these little red circles over here, those are error messages that show up in Xcode as you type. Right now, all that's telling us is that, hey, it looks like you haven't completed this line of code. Xcode's trying to be helpful, but it's okay to ignore them while you're typing a line of code. So just after the message label.text, I'm going to type space, then an equal sign, then another space. And it's really important to have spaces on both sides of the equal sign. If not, your code will complain, it won't run. Again, you've got to pay super close attention to the precision of what you're typing in when you program. But after this space equals space, we're going to type in a double quote and then another double quote right after it. This changes the text that was inside of the message label.text from its old value, this is where your answer will be, to the new value, which is an empty string, nothing between the double quotes. And this will happen when the viewDidLoad function runs, which is when our app first runs. So now we can build and run by pressing on the play button in the upper left-hand corner. I'll click this square stop button first that will stop what's currently running in the simulator. And if I didn't click stop, I'd get a message from Xcode that says, hey, do you want to stop the app that's currently running? And then click play. No errors. Build succeeded. It's hammer time. And when our app runs in the simulator, ho-ho, we don't see anything in the message label. You cleared it out with your message label.text command, setting it equal to an empty string, double quote, double quote. That's why we don't see this is where your answer will be. You wrote your first line of code, Swifter. You put it in your viewDidLoad function, which executes when the app first runs. Good work. Let's do some more. Now we see that we can click on answer my yes no questions, our button here. It doesn't do anything. Let's write some code that creates an action attached to this button that will give us a random 8-ball message. So I'll head back to Xcode. I'm going to hide my attributes inspector by clicking on this icon in the upper right hand corner. And what I need to do is I need to link this button to an action function that I'm going to write in my code. The way I do that is very similar to the way that I created an IB outlet. I'm going to hold down the control key. Then while holding down control, I'm going to click on the object that I want to associate an action with. Then, holding down the control key and holding down the mouse button, I'm going to drag over into my code, see our rubber band line shows up again, and this time, instead of letting go just after where it says class, I'm going to let go just before the last curly brace. You'll see a message box pops up. It looks very similar to the box that we already saw when we were creating an IB outlet, but this one says the connection is an action. Let's go down next to where it says type and select the pull-down menu. You can select UI button instead of any. This lets us verify that yes, we are writing an action that will take place when we click on a button, a user interface button. Now we need to give a name to this action that we want to take place when you click this button. We can use lower camel case for this too. I'm going to name this question button pressed, all lowercase except for the B and the P, no spaces. We don't need to touch anything else in here. So when you've got this entered correctly, click on the connect button and ho-ho! Xcode wrote a function for us. This is a little chunk of code. It says IB action. It's an action associated with an interface builder object, hence the IB. It is a function, hence the word func, and it's named question button pressed. Any code that we type between these curly braces will execute each time the user clicks the button that this action is attached to. Cool. I don't need main storyboard anymore, so I'm going to click on the X in the upper left-hand corner here that will get me out of Assistant Editor mode, back into the standard editor mode, and now I'm going to type more code into viewcontroller.swift. Well, we want this button to get a random value from a list of possible question answers. The way we're going to do this is we're going to create a new variable. We'll call this messages. We'll do this right underneath the IB outlet. So we'll type in the keyword var that says I'm creating a variable, a box that can hold data, and then I'll type a space and then the name I want to give the variable. Or if it helps to think of it this way, the name of the data holding box. I will call this variable, or the data holding box, messages. Then I'll say space equal sign space, because I'm going to fill this box with some stuff on the right hand side of the equal sign, specifically a list of possible messages to choose from. Now, which phrases do you want your prediction ball to offer as predictions? Well, if you want it to behave like the original Magic 8 Ball, Wikipedia has this page that shows the messages that were inside of the classic Magic 8 Ball, but you can replace these with your own messages. If you want to start with the classic messages, I've already typed them up in a format that you can just copy and paste. Now, you'll find this in a Google Doc that's in the same Google Drive where you downloaded the image of the 8 Ball. So if you head back to that Google Drive, it's in this doc here that's called 8 Ball Phrases. So I'm going to click to open that up in Google Docs. Now you can see a bunch of phrases in here, and they're all written as string values. Remember, Swift wants any string of characters that it needs to display written between double quotation marks. So I've added those marks in here. I've also put a comma after the ending quote on each phrase, except for the last one. And that's how we need to write a list of strings that will save in our data holding box. That's the variable called messages. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight all of these phrases. So I'm going to click just after the last double quote of my list of phrases here, and I'm going to drag to select everything starting at the first double quote that's just before the it is certain, the first phrase in my list. I'm going to copy this block of text that I've highlighted by typing Command C. Then I'm going to return to Xcode. And now at this part, I'll introduce another programming term. Now this list of strings that we're saving inside of our messages variable is going to be stored inside what's called an array in Swift. So you can consider an array just to be a list of different values. Now the way that you write an array in Swift is in between square brackets. The square brackets are characters we don't normally type, but on a US Mac keyboard, you'll find the square brackets just to the upper left of the return key. So inside of our code, just after the space that follows the equal sign for var messages equals, we're going to type the open square bracket and then the closed square bracket. And then click in between these brackets, type a Command V to paste the messages, all those messages that we just copied from the Google Doc. They're pasted in. If I scroll down to the last item, I can see that the closing square bracket is on its own line. It looks lonely. I want this to be on the same line as the last string in our messages array, so I'm going to click just in front of that closing square bracket. I'm going to press the delete key to bring it up onto this last line. Now here's another pro tip. You can get Xcode to format things in an easier to read alignment by first selecting all of our code, and we do this by holding down the command key and pressing A. That selects it all. And then we can fix the indentation in our code by holding down the control key, and while we hold it down, press I. Control I for indent. I've just done that, and you can see that my strings are all indented at the same level, much easier to read. So now we've got this messages variable. It's an array of strings. It contains 20 strings. Each of those strings is in double quotes. These are inside of square brackets. The values are separated by commas. That's what makes this an array. And the phrases go from "it is certain" through "very doubtful." So now we're going to use this messages array inside of our IB action, this function named question button pressed. So scroll down there and press return just after the curly brace that starts our function. And in between these two curly braces, we're going to type in the code that we want to execute when our button is pressed. Now, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to get a random value from our elements inside of this array called messages. So we're going to create a data holding box to hold a single random message that we're going to select. Now, we could create a variable here, but we're going to create something called a constant. Variables can have values that change. They can be varied, hence the name variable. Constant values can't be changed. They remain constant, hence the name constant. Now, if we didn't create a constant and decided to use a variable, our code would work. It's just that Xcode would show us a little yellow warning in our code that says, hey, since you didn't vary or change the data in this value, you should really use a constant here. It's no big deal, but it makes your code run faster. In our case, the difference is imperceptible, but we'll skip the variable here because if we did, Xcode would recommend that we use a constant, and this gives us a chance to talk about constants versus variables. So variables are like a box where you can replace the contents with new values. Constants are like a box where the data is etched in concrete. It can't be changed, it's constant. And while we create variables with the keyword var, we create constants with the keyword let. So we'll say let, then type a space, create the name of an unchanging value that will hold a random message. We'll call that selected message, lower camel case. Then we'll say space equals space, just like we do when setting other values. And then we want to get a random element from our messages array. Now remember, we defined messages up here. It's an array, hence the square brackets, that contains a list of strings. Remember, each of these phrases is inside of double quotes separated by commas. So down here, we set selected message equal to. Now look, when we start typing messages, code completion knows about this value that we just created. It even tells us to the left of messages that it's an array, see the square brackets, of strings, see the word string in between those square brackets? And again, that refers to this array of messages we have up here. So we'll highlight and select this value and press return. And now what we want to do is we want to select a random element from this array of messages. And built into anything that's an array is a special function called random element. And we can access this also using dot notation, the same thing we use to get at the text property and message label. But this time we're going to get that special function random element. So after messages, type in dot, then the word random. We can see random element shows up here. Code completion describes what this does. It says it returns a random element from a collection. An array is called a collection in Swift because it's a type that can hold a collection of values. It returns a string, so we see string in here. Ignore the question mark. We don't need to know about that at this stage when we're developing our first app. But the M stands for something called methods. Now methods are just functions that are attached to certain values. So every array has a random element function or a random element method. So again, we're accessing it through dot notation by typing dot random element after the value we want to get a random element from. So make sure that you've selected random element, press return. Swift adds the open and close parentheses after random element. Methods need parentheses after them. Some methods will have us pass values in between the parentheses, but this one doesn't. Xcode gives us everything we need. Thank you, Xcode. And this line will give us a random element from messages and put that value inside this value that we're creating called selected message. Now, what do we want to do with selected message? We want to put it inside of the text attribute of our message label. Hey, we did that up here in viewDidLoad. I'm going to highlight this line of code, message label.text equals empty string, copy it with a Command C, paste it below the line of code where we created selected message. That's with a Command V. But I'm going to backspace over the two double quotes that are an empty string, and I'm going to replace that with this constant selected message that we created just above it. What is this going to do? It's going to take the selected message that we just got as a random element from messages, and it's going to slap it into the text attribute of our message label. This is all we need to write to make our code work. Let's build and run and see what we get. I'm going to click the stop square, then I'm going to click the play triangle. No errors, hammer time, build succeeded. When the app first runs, viewDidLoad runs once and only once. It sets message label.text equal to an empty string, so I don't see anything inside of my message label. Then the moment of truth. I'm about to click on my answer my yes no question button. When I do that, it will execute my IB action, this function here called question button pressed. It will create a new constant called selected message, which goes up into my messages array. It will grab a random element. Then we'll go into message label.text and we'll set that equal to the new selected message that we just got in the line above. Let's see how this works. Is my code going to work? Magic 8-Ball, tell me. Yes, it works. Congratulations, coder. Even if you didn't get a yes that came up here because you may have a different random message, you've just built a prediction ball app. Now, just in case you're wondering, and this is a more advanced topic, we'll cover this in a future video, but you might have thought, hey, I thought selected message was a let constant and it can't change, but we're getting different messages every time we click a button. Well, that's right, but selected message only lives as long as the function question button pressed runs, because we've defined it or created it with this let statement inside of question button pressed. So we click the button, selected message is created with this let statement, we assign it to message label.text, then the function is done running, and this selected message vanishes. It no longer exists. Click the button again, selected message is recreated. Now, you want to put your app on an iOS device and run it outside the simulator to impress your friends and loved ones? Well, you can go to the playlist at bit.ly/profgswift and find the video named Create an App Icon and install your app on a device. The steps in here will be the same as the ones that we use in our You Are Awesome app, but you could use them in your Magic 8-Ball app. I've also got one more video that shows you how to modify your Magic 8-Ball so that it responds to a shake gesture and it fades a message onto the middle of the 8-ball. You can try that one too. If you did, let me know. You can tweet at me at Gallagher. That's spelled like Gal-laugh-er, but I pronounce it Gallagher. If you use the hashtag iOS Code Crush, all one word, you might be selected in our weekly drawing for an ultra cool My Mac Builds App laptop sticker. Whoa, that'll impress your friends too. And if you want to follow more of my videos, there's my whole 0 to full stack semester-long university course with all the videos online free for you. You can find them at bit.ly/Gallagher YouTube, upper camel case, all one word. If you are so inclined, kindly like and subscribe. Information on my Swift textbook is at gallagher.com/Swift. Stay Swifty. Nice work.